Welcome to the series premiere of Chicago Politics, a groundbreaking new television program that will change your view of political news in Chicago. I'm Hugo Balta, publisher of Illinois Latino News, and your host. Bring Chicago Home was Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's response to address homelessness, but the referendum didn't get enough votes in the primary election. Mr. Johnson's Chief of Staff, Cristina Pacione-Zayas, is with us front and center to discuss what went wrong and what comes next. In the segment For the People, lead correspondent Samantha Lampkin visits residents in the South Loop to hear firsthand why voters believe part of the failure was communication. And in the first edition of Voices, Jose Muñoz, executive director of La Casa Norte, who has experienced homelessness himself, has the last word on creating a revenue stream to help the unhoused. Now, supporters and opponents of Bring Chicago Home, the high-end real estate transfer tax hike, are still processing what happened in the March primary and how to proceed. The proposal aimed to generate $100 million a year for homeless services. The defeat was a major blow to advocates, including Mayor Brandon Johnson, who campaigned for the measure. Mayor Johnson's newly appointed Chief of Staff, Cristina Pacione-Zayas, is front and center with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Chief.
Thank you for having me.
And congratulations on your new appointment.
Thank you. Really excited about it.
So let's start with the question, what went wrong in regards to Bring Chicago Home?
Well, it was a pretty complicated campaign. We were very hopeful because we have to remember that, Bring Chicago Home didn't just emerge with the campaign to elect Mayor Brandon Johnson. It actually had been a long time coming. A lot of coalitions had come together, had developed a strategy, but we're really looking for an opportunity to champion it and obviously push it through the legislative process. You may recall the last administration didn't even allow for a vote to get it on the ballot. So we were successful in obviously being able to pursue that. And then there would be an opportunity to bring it to the public and obviously for them to vote on it. We had a lot of opposition. There was a lot of confusion. Opposition particularly took advantage of that and then had taken us to court, which obviously pushed along the confusion because people didn't know if it was on the ballot. They didn't know if their vote would count. All of those kind of pieces coming together. Not to mention the fact that once it got on the ballot, the administration could not talk about it. Ethics laws prevent us from being able to talk explicitly about something that is an electoral measure.
Now, confusion is something that we'll go back to. It's certainly one of the things that critics point out in regards to why it failed. As a response to homelessness, the city of Los Angeles passed the mansion tax, a similar tax in 2022, increasing transfer taxes for properties sold for more than $5 million. It has been reported that, quote, high-end real estate market went off a cliff, partly because nobody was selling. Here are some insights in regards to that measure. It was predicted that $900 million in revenue each year would be generated by this measure, but 1 year after it took effect, that figure was in the mayor's budget for $150 million. So here's my question. In a comparable city like Los Angeles, if this didn't work, why do you think the Johnson administration felt it was going to work here in Chicago? Now, I get it that this is something he perhaps inherited. We're talking about the previous administration, but it's something that he did support. Why do you think the administration did back something that hasn't worked somewhere else?
I think you have to look at the way that that was structured is very different, and what we had presented actually, the transfer tax in California, there's one in LA, there's one in San Francisco, and there's another one in New York. All of those are around the range of like 5.5% to 6%. All we were saying was we wanted a transfer tax of 3%. And it was graduated, right? For every single dollar after $1 million, it would then be in different tiers leading up to 3%, which is a significantly much lower percentage for a transfer tax. And you would have also at the same time, simultaneously, 95% of homeowners getting a cut in the transfer tax, because currently our transfer tax is 0.75%. It would have actually dropped everyone below $1 million to 0.67. So, I mean, it just is. The point is that if you want to solve for homelessness, you have to pay for it. There's no way around it, and you have to identify a dedicated, stable funding stream to be able to do that, and that was what was the proposition that was on the table.
Prior to the referendum, another thing that another measure that the Johnson administration was pushing for was the $1.25 billion commitment, which got passed afterwards with the city council. You just said we need to invest money to solve homelessness. This measure, while it passed, also had some critics and last-minute posturing in regards to defining it, primarily how the money's going to be spent. Tell us about this $1.25 billion commitment.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that. And I'm so glad that you're also juxtaposing it against Bring Chicago Home, because they are two separate initiatives. The first kind of distinction is to look at the bond, the $1.25 billion bond, as an investment. You may be aware of TIFs, tax increment financing districts. Those were actually brought about through Mayor Harold Washington. The idea was to, when you have a blighted area and you have property taxes that go up, it goes into this particular fund to have some very targeted investment, right? Well, historically, we have not been able to live up to the intent of TIFs, and they've actually been incredibly inequitable in terms of the distribution of those dollars and where they have gone in areas that have actually been more affluent or more economically stable versus where they should have gone with the intent of more blighted communities, right? So what we're doing is we're actually allowing some of the TIFs to expire, because a TIF has a lifespan of about 23 years unless you go back and extend it in Springfield. The point is that by letting those TIFs expire, it then comes back into the corporate fund and then allows us to make these investments. The excess funds that come on TIFs are actually going to pay down the bonds. So City of Chicago, you know, taxpayers are not going to pay for this. And so it's a very innovative way to be able to invest in our city, particularly in areas that historically have been underinvested, and then have an array of kind of programs that come out of it, from affordable home ownership to affordable rental units to and such as green social housing, and then also the SRO preservation and permanent supportive housing. So all of those programs are now being developed now that we've passed the bond and we have, you know, some dedicated funding resources.
Now, you mentioned TIFs, and TIFs since 1984 has been riddled in regards to where the money's going and where it's being used. The intention was to help people with affordable housing. Mm-hmm. That wasn't always the case. A lot of critics are saying the same thing about this plan. Now, you're paying off a loan over 37 years, which means this administration will be at the starting line, but not at the finish line. Transparency is paramount, right? Everybody's asking for transparency, beginning with the city council. How do you ensure transparency to make sure that the money's going where it is needed the most?
There's various measures to do that. You know, anything in development usually does pass through city council approval, right? It can be whether it's the low-income tax credits, it can be the various other kind of sources, and also, mind you, whatever is built through bond or expanded, augmented, renovated through bond is usually a layered approach to funding. And so these particular projects at some level will have exposure to city council, and there will be some discussion and there will be some planning that is collaborative. You know, so there is going to be that opportunity. And then, you know, there'll be quarterly reports. There will be other ways that we put information out. I think one thing that is pretty unique about this administration is how we attempt to infuse co-governance into everything we do, from our budget engagement process to how we are opening up mental health clinics and involving a working group and community hearings as a result of that. And so this is not going to be something that, you know, we're going to do behind closed doors. It is obviously a big deal. This is the biggest bond initiative in the country. And so we're really excited about sharing this opportunity with Chicago.
Wonderful. And we'll certainly continue to have that conversation and look to see where the money goes. One of the questions I wanted to, well, an example I wanted to talk about is the City of Chicago has a housing first approach. City data shows that from 2020 to 2022, Chicago found housing for close to 1,900 households experiencing homelessness. Mayor Johnson said that's not enough. Some evidence, for people who are not familiar with housing first approach, this is an evidence-based approach to ending homelessness that provides people with immediate access to housing and support services without preconditions. The belief is that people need to have their basic needs met before addressing other issues like employment or substance abuse. Now, Houston revamped its entire system to get more people into housing quickly, and it cut homelessness by more than half. San Diego attempted a series of one-offs projects but saw far fewer reductions in homelessness. If the mayor says that what's been done is not enough, is part of the money that's going to be invested, is it going to perhaps solve some of the limitations that he sees in regards to HF?
Absolutely. There's a few programs that are initiatives around solving for homelessness that we have been, you know, recognized for. The first is the rapid rehousing program, and that in fact has been recognized to the extent that our Office of Inspector General lifted it up as a model and something for us to expand on, which we actually are through bond, through our ARPA investments. Those are the COVID relief dollars that came from the federal government. We just actually a week and a half ago made an announcement about how we are reappropriating those dollars to be very targeted, and $32 million is going towards rapid rehousing. What you're speaking to in terms of having those wraparound supports is what we call permanent supportive housing. So making sure that, you know, not only are people sheltered and in their own home, but they receive the mental and behavioral health services. They receive substance use disorder supports. They receive, you know, whatever it is, the medical attention that's needed to be self-sufficient and to be self-determined. And those are the types of investments that we are making through the bond, through our corporate fund. Actually, we put $250 million towards housing and homelessness when we passed our budget in November, which is now enacted for 2024. So with an array of all of these different funding sources, whether it's bond, whether it's ARPA, whether it's our corporate fund, I think what that demonstrates is that, you know, while we still believe in the concept of Bring Chicago Home, and, you know, who knows, there might be another attempt to pass that. The point is that you have to have a kind of diversified portfolio in terms of your revenue streams, but ultimately you have to make the investments. There's no way around it.
Hindsight's 2020. That's going back to Bring Chicago Home. You mentioned that part of why it didn't pass was confusion. I know when I went to the polls and I looked at the referendum, it was confusing, and I consider myself somewhat well informed. Moving forward, and you mentioned perhaps in the future, so the administration supporting something like Bring Chicago Home. What are some of the lessons learned from this go around that you hope to apply in the future?
I think we need to help people understand that, you know, homelessness is, it's pretty pervasive in our city. You know, it's about, right now we have about 67,000 people who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability. You know, the definition that we use in Chicago Public Schools through the McKinney-Vento Act is actually inclusive of doubling up. We have 17,000 Chicago public school students who are identified as students in temporary living situations. And so when you start to look at it from the aspect of, you know, this isn't just a one-off random situation, there have been structural policies and kind of interlocking systems of oppression that have created homelessness. Wages have not been, you know, up to par to be able to purchase a home, or let alone afford rent in, you know, a neighborhood. It's hard to get, you know, a 2-bedroom apartment under $1,000 in most neighborhoods, right? If you're a working family, you can't just get by with one income. It's multiple incomes, and you may have, you know, households with heads of households with multiple jobs. So all of those things to really say that this is a really complex problem, but it also is a problem that we have created in many ways because we haven't fought for working wages. But, you know, this administration got rid of the sub-minimum tipped wage. The same with paid time off and making sure that people have access to those types of benefits. I know this may sound like I'm kind of talking around it, but when we think about the origins and the root causes of violence, you have to also think about the comprehensive strategy to be able to address it. The same with mental and behavioral health. That's why we have a mental health system expansion initiative during the campaign. It was known as Treatment Not Trauma. We're opening up our mental health institutions. But back to your question about, like, was it confusing and how was it? I think it's really about issue education and helping to bring home why we need to make these particular investments. The safest, most sustainable, most resilient communities invest in people and invest in structures to ensure that we have our most basic needs met and people are set up to thrive. And so I think it's going to really be about a lot of issue education and helping people understand how we get there. And it's not just by talking about it, you're going to have to invest in it as well.
Agreed. I think education is going to be key for the public to understand measures in the future in order for them to make the best informed decisions. And I also agree, what got us here today, whether it's homelessness, gun violence, or other, it's stemmed in a history of inequity that got us to this point, and might take us equally as much time to dismantle that structure in order to achieve equity. Chief of Staff Cristina Pacione-Zayas, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
As previously mentioned, communication was among the limitations that critics say prevented Bring Chicago Home from crossing the finish line. Next on Chicago Politics, lead correspondent Samantha Lampkin speaks with voters in the South Loop about fear, confusion, and misinformation.
Hey Chicago, are you ready to be a part of history? The Democratic National Convention is coming to town this summer from August 19th to the 22nd, and we need your help. Whether you're 16 or 60, we have a role for you. From greeting delegates and assisting with wayfinding to working inside of the United Center, we need you to make this a world-class event. Help show up for Chicago by signing up today at chicago2024.com/volunteer and be a part of something extraordinary.
The Bring Chicago Home referendum appeared to be on track for a loss before the polls closed on primary election night. Supporters of the measure suggested that factors such as low voter turnout, uncertainty among residents about the issue, and concerns about its implementation may have contributed to the outcome. That was the very subject that Chicago Politics lead correspondent Samantha Lampkin spoke to residents in the South Loop neighborhood. She joins us now with the insights.
Thank you, Hugo. That's right. The Bring Chicago Home referendum was met with a resounding no by Chicago voters. The paragraph-long explanation on the ballot gave details of what the referendum would mean if it was voted for. But did the ballot language really tell us what we needed to know? I traveled to the South Loop neighborhood, and of course, the people are talking. From the low voter turnout in the 2024 Illinois primary to why the Bring Chicago Home referendum was unsuccessful. Those are just a few of the questions on today's For the People. We're here in South Loop on the corner of 21st and Michigan. Now, South Loop holds its spot in Chicago's history as one of its first original residential districts, and also known as the first real Gold Coast. And in South Loop, there are lots of hidden gems, including this place, Issues Barber Beauty Salon. And inside these doors, there's no shortage of quality haircuts, hairstyles, and some real conversation. Now, I got their opinions on voting in the Illinois primary and more on today's For the People. To vote or not to vote? That's the question being asked to staff and clients at Chicago's own Issues Barber and Beauty Salon. Now let's keep it real. Did you vote? Any of y'all, did y'all vote in the March primary election?
No, ma'am.
No.
Okay, why didn't you vote, Marcus?
I don't think politics has really too much to do with us as black people.
According to the Chicago Board of Elections, numbers show that out of 1.7 million registered voters, only 20.2% of those voted. That number includes day of, early voting, and vote by mail ballots. In 2012, however, turnout was 24% citywide. Steve, did you hear about Bring Chicago Home?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so Bring Chicago Home, as we kind of discussed, it's basically a tax move by the mayor, Mayor Brandon Johnson. He proposed it. It was an amendment on the Illinois primary election. So it didn't pass because basically the people with money thought that they were going to siphon it from them to give to the homeless. So do you think y'all would have even voted for Bring Chicago Home? Midge, what about you? Would you have voted for that?
Probably not.
And why not?
Well, honestly, I feel like a lot of people fault Brandon for a lot of things, but once a person is elected, I still feel like it's a muscle behind them. Like the decisions are not solely up to them. I definitely trust Brandon, but I feel like whatever decision is made, it's not solely up to him. Yeah. Like it's a machine behind him and he has to do what the machine says.
Supporters of the ordinance say that the tax would generate $100 million annually. However, opposers say it would have a devastating impact on commercial property sales and an already declining business occupancy rate in Chicago. And Marcus, you kind of mentioned something like that too. With the voting, you don't really see it helping us. So voting for something like Bring Chicago Home, do you really think it would have brought Chicago home?
No. Well, that money probably would have been taken and used for something else.
Bring Chicago Home, to me, could have been something great. It sounds great. It sounds like a great idea because we living in the United States, rich people, they rich. They got enough. They got more than enough. And to just help out people who literally have nothing, to me, is not a problem. But again, if I was trusted that my money was really going to help the homeless and help the less fortunate, then yes, of course it would be happening. But
there can be many speculations as to why the Bring Chicago Home referendum didn't pass by the voters of the 2024 Illinois primary, especially since the second largest city in the U.S., Los Angeles, passed a similar referendum in 2022. Shout out to everybody at Issues Barber and Beauty Salon for their opinions on this Illinois primary election and why they do or don't vote. I'm Samantha Lampkin, and this is For the People. Hugo, as you saw there, it's a double push to not only get registered voters to the polls, but also to get them to understand what's even on the ballots. There's also other thoughts with just going and voting as well.
Now, Samantha, some of the people you spoke with talked about mistrust in government. Did they share anything more about that? Is it a lack of trust in individuals or just the system itself?
I would say both. If you don't trust the people, how can you trust the ideas that the people are creating? And it still becomes an issue of relatability as well. Now, most of the political language isn't clear. And then when voting day arrives, you're expected to just say yes or no. Most people, especially those with a lack of understanding, they're going to roll with the no.
Thank you, Samantha. It's exciting to be working with you. I look forward to more For the People segments.
Thank you, Hugo.
Over 68,000 Chicagoans are experiencing homelessness. Jose Muñoz, Executive Director of La Casa Norte, was one of them. In the first edition of our Voices segment, Mr. Muñoz will have the last word on Bring Chicago Home and raising funding for homelessness prevention programs. That's next on Chicago Politics.
On the spring premiere of Chicago Newsroom 2.0, We'll unpack the latest news about CPS, CTA, and the Chicago Bears with journalists Francia Garcia Hernandez and Deborah Douglas. We'll also talk with the board chair of Spanish Coalition for Housing, Paul Lopez. Join the conversation Sunday, May 19th at 12:30 p.m. on CAN TV Cable Channel 19 or stream live on cantv.org or on the CAN TV Plus app. Hyperlocal news and public affairs. Experience the power of community television.
Now it's time for a little segment of Chicago politics we like to call around here Pass-Fail, where we take a look at our elected officials and see if they're making the grade. First off, the Illinois General Assembly passed Senate Bill No. 1, the Department of Early Childhood Act, which authorizes the development of a new early childhood department. The action makes Illinois the first state in the nation to extend protections to all children from birth to age 5, regardless of immigration status. Well done. Pass. Next, advocates are warning that up to 40,000 youth statewide may lose access to vital after-school programs this summer unless Illinois lawmakers provide additional funding. The issue stems from a miscalculation by ISB in 2023, leading to insufficient funds to renew expiring grants for many programs. Advocates are urging $50 million in state funding to ensure these programs can continue to provide tutoring services, recreation, and other extracurricular activities for youth in need. Children will potentially pay for mistakes of those entrusted with their well-being. Fair. And recently, Mayor Brandon Johnson rebuffed critics who said he was not doing anything to avoid the chaos at the Democratic National Convention this August. The mayor says his team is working with police department and the Secret Service to ensure that the convention is peaceful and safe. With less than 100 days until the convention, you can count on us paying close attention to preparations and that the DNC will be the topic of discussion in future editions of Chicago Politics. So we'll give it an incomplete for now. What do you think? We want to know. Send us your feedback to chicagopolitics@cantv.org. And finally, on this edition of Chicago Politics, we've been discussing the failed Bring Chicago Home referendum. The proposal aimed to generate $100 million a year for homeless services. As we heard from residents in the South Loop who spoke to Samantha, what cannot be lost in the often endless bickering about who's right, who's wrong, are the people at the center of the debate. Jose Muñoz, Executive Director of La Casa Norte, knows all too well the plight of the unhoused, both through his work and lived experience. He is our first guest on Voices.
Today, we reflect on the journey of the Bring Chicago Home initiative. While it may not have passed at the ballot box, it ignited an unprecedented spark of compassion and awareness across our city. Throughout the campaign, we witnessed an outpouring of support from activists, business and community leaders, young people, and families, all rallying behind a common cause to address homelessness in our communities. Despite the outcome, we've achieved something remarkable, a heightened dialogue on the plight of our unhoused neighbors. This initiative brought the issue to the forefront of the public consciousness, sparking conversations in homes, workplaces, and legislative chambers. And while the ballot measure did not succeed, Mayor Brandon Johnson and his administration has shown an unwavering commitment to tackling homelessness head-on. From hiring Chicago's first chief homeless officer, Cindy Soto, to developing a 5-year plan to end homelessness, to recently announcing a $1.25 billion bond deal to support affordable housing and economic development. This monumental investment signifies a turning point in our city's approach to homelessness. It's not just about providing temporary fixes, it's about creating sustainable solutions that uplift individuals and families. And as we move forward, let's remember the spirit of unity and compassion that drove the Bring Chicago Home initiative. Together, we can build a city where every person has a place to call home. I'm Jose Muñoz, Executive Director of La Casa Norte.
A special thank you to Jose Muñoz for sharing his time and insights, and to Mayor Brandon Johnson's Chief of Staff, Cristina Pacione-Zayas, for joining us.
And a shout out to the team from Issues Barber Beauty Salon who took the time to speak with me on For the People. Now we want to thank you all for joining us on the first of what we at CAN TV hopes will be many episodes of Chicago Politics.
where we go beyond the surface level discussions and dive deep into societal issues that are impacting the diverse communities in Chicago.
Now let's keep the conversation going on social media and via email at chicagopolitics@cantv.org.
On behalf of all of us at Chicago Politics, thank you for investing your time with us.